In 1113 BC, three Vestal Virgins were accused of breaking their vows. The punishment wasn't just death, it was calculated psychological torture. Buried alive in underground chambers with just enough food and water to survive for days, they would slowly suffocate in complete darkness while Rome celebrated above them. Archaeological evidence found in the 1800s confirmed these burial chambers existed exactly where ancient sources described. The last recorded live burial was in 83 AD, but the terror lasted a millennium. Before we descend into the dark truth of Rome's most sacred priestesses, if you're fascinated by the hidden horrors of history, hit that like button and subscribe. Comment below to let me know where you're watching from. It's incredible how we're connected across the world by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand the horror of being a Vestal Virgin, we must first understand what they represented. In a society where women had virtually no legal rights, where daughters passed from the ownership of their fathers to their husbands, where even wealthy patrician women could not vote, own property, or make legal decisions, the Vestals stood alone. They were Rome's only female priests, guardians of the sacred flame in the temple of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. This flame, Romans believed, was the mystical heart of the city itself. If it went out, disaster would follow: military defeat, plague, famine, the collapse of civilization. For over 1,000 years, from Rome's founding in 753 BC until 394 AD, when Christianity became the state religion, 6 Vestal Virgins kept this flame burning every hour of every day. But the power they wielded came at a price so terrible that ancient sources described families weeping when their daughters were chosen. The selection process, called the capsho, reveals the first layer of horror in this supposedly sacred institution. When a Vestal Virgin died or completed her 30-year service, the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, would begin the hunt for her replacement. The criteria were specific and disturbing. The girl must be between 6 and 10 years old. Both parents must be living. She must be physically perfect, with no deformities, and she must come from a patrician family of good reputation. 20 candidates would be selected from Rome's aristocratic families. On the appointed day, these little girls, barely old enough to understand what was happening, were brought to the forum. Ancient sources describe them dressed in white, trembling as they stood before the Pontifex Maximus while he examined each one. The selection wasn't random. The priest would study their faces, looking for signs of character, purity, and most importantly, malleability. He needed girls who could be broken and reshaped, who would internalize the terror of their position so completely that they would police themselves for 3 decades. When the final choice was made, the priest would grasp the chosen girl's hand and speak the ancient formula: "I take you, beloved, to be a Vestal priestess, to perform the sacred rites according to the law on behalf of the Roman people." The word beloved drips with irony. What followed was anything but love. The girl was immediately separated from her family. Ancient sources describe mothers trying to follow their daughters into the temple complex, begging to say goodbye, only to be forcibly removed by guards. The child was now property of the goddess Vesta, owned by the state, her family ties legally severed as completely as if she had died. The temple complex where she would spend the next 30 years was called the Atrium Vesta. From the outside it looked like a palace: beautiful gardens, elegant architecture, luxurious furnishings. But for the 6 girls and women trapped inside, it was a prison designed to maintain the fiction of honor while delivering systematic psychological torture. The new Vesta's training began immediately. First came the physical marking. Though Roman law forbade branding citizens, Vestas existed in a legal gray area, technically freed from their father's authority. They belonged to the goddess. Ancient sources describe a small brand placed on the inner wrist, hidden by the long sleeves of their white robes, a permanent reminder that they were property. The training lasted 10 years. During this novice period, the girl learned the complex rituals required to maintain the sacred flame, to prepare the mulla salsa, a salted flour used in sacrifices, and to perform the ceremonies that marked Rome's religious calendar. But more importantly, she learned fear. The rules governing Vestal behavior were impossibly strict. She could not touch or be touched by any man except the Pontifex Maximus during official ceremonies. She could not leave the temple complex without permission and escort. She could not let the sacred flame go out under any circumstances. She could not engage in any behavior that might be interpreted as sexual, from accepting flowers from a man to laughing too freely in mixed company. Most terrifying of all, she had to remain a virgin for 30 years, not just physically, but in thought and appearance. Any hint of sexuality, any suggestion that she had experienced or even desired sexual contact was grounds for the ultimate punishment. Live burial. The psychological impact of this on a child can barely be imagined. From age 6 or 7, she was taught that her body was both sacred and dangerous, that any normal human impulse could result in her being buried alive. She watched the older Vestals, saw their fear, heard the whispered stories of those who had been condemned. Terror became her constant companion. After 10 years of training, the girl, now a teenager, entered her second decade of service. This was the period when she actively maintained the sacred flame and performed the major religious ceremonies. It was also the period of greatest danger, because adolescence brought physical changes that the Roman system viewed as threats to purity. The Temple of Vesta never slept. The 6 priestesses divided time into shifts, ensuring that at least 2 were always awake, watching the flame. If it went out during your watch, the punishment was immediate and brutal. Ancient sources describe the flogging of Vestals whose flames died. They were taken to a private chamber within the temple complex, stripped naked, and beaten with rods by the Pontifex Maximus himself. The beating continued until blood ran down their backs and pooled on the marble floor. This wasn't done in anger, but with cold ritualistic precision. Each strike was a prayer, each wound a purification. But letting the flame die was a minor offense compared to the crime of incestum, unchastity. The mere accusation was enough to trigger an investigation that resembled less a trial than a witch hunt. The accusation could come from anyone: a rival Vestal jealous of another's privileges, a politician seeking to deflect blame for military defeats or natural disasters, a rejected suitor creating rumors. Once made, the charge had to be investigated, and the investigation itself was designed to produce guilt regardless of truth. The accused Vestal was immediately confined to her quarters, while the Pontifical College, a body of male priests, gathered evidence. This evidence consisted largely of torture of the virgin servants and slaves. Under Roman law, slave testimony was only valid if obtained through torture, ensuring that terrified attendants would say whatever their questioners wanted to hear. The trial was held in the Forum, before thousands of Roman citizens. The Vestal was brought out in her white robes, her head covered, as if for sacrifice. She was not permitted to speak in her own defense. Her fate was decided entirely by the Pontifical College, with no appeal possible. If found guilty, and most accused Vestals were, the punishment was calculated to maximize both suffering and the appearance of religious propriety. Rome couldn't simply execute a sacred priestess. The solution was burial alive, a death that technically didn't violate her body or spill her sacred blood. The condemned Vestal was dressed in funeral clothes and placed in a covered litter like a corpse being carried to burial. But she was fully conscious, and she could hear the crowd that gathered to watch her final journey. Ancient sources describe these crowds as enormous, tens of thousands of Romans lining the streets as the procession moved from the Forum to the Campus Celeratus, the evil field, a small plot of land just inside Rome's city walls reserved specifically for this purpose. The contrast between her treatment and that of other condemned criminals was stark. Common criminals were executed quickly, their deaths public but brief. The Vestal's death would be slow, private, and infinitely more terrible. When the procession reached the Campus Celeratus, the litter was opened. The Vestal, often barely able to stand from fear, was led down a narrow staircase into an underground chamber. Ancient sources provide chilling details about these chambers. They were small, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, with stone walls and a single entrance from above. Inside was a bed, a small oil lamp, and provisions, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, a cup of milk, and a bit of oil for the lamp. Enough to survive for perhaps 3 or 4 days, but no more. The symbolism was deliberate. Rome was technically not killing her. It was simply sealing her underground and allowing the gods to decide her fate. If she were truly innocent, divine intervention would save her. Of course, no divine intervention ever came. Once the Vestal was inside, the Pontifex Maximus would perform a final ritual at the entrance. He would speak prayers to Vesta, asking the goddess to show mercy if the woman was innocent. Then he would give the signal. Workers would slide a heavy stone slab over the entrance, sealing the chamber completely. Dirt would be piled on top, and the ground leveled so that within hours nothing visible remained of the burial site except a small marker stone. Below ground, in absolute darkness once her lamp oil burned out, the condemned Vestal faced her final hours alone. The air in the sealed chamber would gradually become stale as she breathed in oxygen and exhaled carbon dioxide. Eventually, the carbon dioxide levels would rise to toxic levels, causing confusion, terror, and finally unconsciousness and death. For centuries, these burial chambers were considered myths or exaggerations by ancient writers. Then in 1883, archaeologist Rodolfo Lanciani made a horrifying discovery near the Column Gate in Rome. He found exactly what ancient sources had described: a small underground chamber containing skeletal remains surrounded by artifacts matching ancient descriptions, pottery for water and oil, evidence of fabric that had once been clothing, and most disturbingly, deep scratch marks on the stone walls. The skeletal analysis revealed signs of violent struggle, broken fingernails, scratch marks on bone that suggested desperate clawing at sealed entrances, and body positions that indicated the victims were conscious and fighting when they were sealed in. Further excavations found additional chambers. In 1981, another burial site was discovered beneath what is now Via Nomentana. The pattern was consistent: small chambers, evidence of provisions, signs of struggle. The case of 1113 BC became the most notorious Vestal Virgin trial in Roman history, not because it was unusual, but because ancient sources recorded it in such detail. 3 Vestals, Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, were accused simultaneously of breaking their vows. The accusations came during a period of military defeats and natural disasters, and Romans believed the gods were angry because the sacred virgins had been corrupted. The initial trial resulted in Aemilia's conviction and live burial, while Licinia and Marcia were acquitted. But public outrage at this perceived leniency led to a second trial. This time, the tribune Peducaeus demanded authority from the Senate to retry the 2 acquitted Vestals. The second trial was even more theatrical than the first. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen the Vestals in compromising positions. Their male accusers, a group of equestrians, were also put on trial and executed. The message was clear. The men had corrupted Rome's sacred virgins and deserved death, but the Vestals themselves, as women, bore even greater guilt for allowing themselves to be corrupted. Licinia and Marcia were convicted in the second trial and buried alive alongside their already deceased sister Aemilia. 3 women died to appease public fear and restore confidence in Roman military fortunes. What happened to the men accused of sleeping with Vestal Virgins reveals the grotesque gender politics underlying this entire system. While the Vestals faced live burial, slow, terrifying, and private, their male accomplices received a very different treatment. They were publicly executed in the Roman Forum, typically by scourging, beating to death with rods, or strangulation. This was brutal, but it was quick. More importantly, it was the same death given to common criminals. The men weren't considered to have committed a religious offense, merely a civil crime. The asymmetry is striking. The man who allegedly corrupted a Vestal died in minutes amid a cheering crowd. The Vestal herself died over days in solitary darkness, her crime framed as a pollution of Rome's sacred essence, rather than simply sexual transgression. Defenders of the Vestal system, both ancient and modern, point to the unusual privileges these women enjoyed, and the privileges were real, unprecedented for Roman women. Vestals could own property in their own names. They could make legally binding wills, determining who would inherit their possessions. They had the power to grant pardons to condemned criminals by simply interceding on their behalf. They had front row seats at gladiatorial games and theatrical performances. They were escorted by lictors, the ceremonial guards usually reserved for high magistrates. But these privileges existed within a framework of terror. A Vestal could own property, but she couldn't have a family to leave it to. She could pardon criminals, but she herself could be buried alive on mere accusation. She had the best seats at the games, but she couldn't speak freely with the man sitting beside her without risking her life. The privileges weren't compensations for service. They were the gilding on a cage, designed to make imprisonment look like honor. The Vestal's service was divided into 3 periods, each lasting 10 years. The first decade, discipula, was training. The second, ministra, was active service, maintaining the flame and performing rituals. The third, magistra, involved teaching younger Vestals and supervising temple operations. After 30 years, a Vestal was theoretically free to leave, reclaim her family name, marry, and live as a normal Roman woman. But the reality was far more complicated. A woman who entered the temple at age 6 emerged at 36, past prime marriageable age by Roman standards. She had no experience with normal social interactions, no understanding of household management outside the temple context, no network of family connections that hadn't atrophied over 3 decades of separation. Ancient sources record several Vestals choosing to remain in the temple after their service ended. Some historians interpret this as evidence the position wasn't truly oppressive. If women voluntarily stayed, how bad could it have been? But imagine the psychology of a woman who had spent 30 years in a system that taught her every human impulse was dangerous. The outside world would be terrifying, filled with temptations and possibilities for error. The temple, for all its horrors, was familiar. Many former Vestals simply didn't know how to be anything except what they had been made to be. The Vestal Virgin trials were never just about sexual purity. They were political weapons, deployed strategically during times of crisis to redirect public anger and restore confidence in divine favor. When Rome suffered military defeats, when plagues swept through the city, when harvest failed or the Tiber flooded, citizens demanded explanations. In a religious worldview, where natural disasters were divine punishment for human offenses, somebody had to be blamed. Vestal virgins provided perfect scapegoats. Accusing a Vestal of incestum allowed politicians to claim they had identified the source of Rome's troubles. The trial itself became a public spectacle that reinforced religious authority and social hierarchy. The execution demonstrated decisive action. Rome was purifying itself, appeasing angry gods, restoring cosmic order. The pattern repeats throughout Roman history. Major Vestal trials cluster around periods of political instability or military crisis. The accused were almost always convicted, regardless of evidence, because acquittal would suggest the gods remained angry and Rome's troubles would continue. The last recorded live burial of a Vestal virgin occurred in 83 AD under Emperor Domitian, and it reveals how the system had evolved or devolved into pure theatrical cruelty. Cornelia, chief Vestal at the time, was accused of incestum. The evidence was thin, even by the standards of Vestal trials, essentially just rumors and the testimony of tortured slaves. But Domitian, desperate to appear pious and restore traditional Roman values after years of political chaos, was determined to make an example. Cornelia was not given a trial in the traditional sense. Domitian simply declared her guilty and ordered her burial. When she protested her innocence, crying out to Vesta and the gods to witness the injustice, Domitian had her beaten into silence. The burial itself became an elaborate state ceremony. Cornelia was paraded through Rome in full Vestal regalia, then stripped and forced to descend into her underground chamber, while Domitian himself supervised. Ancient sources describe her final words. "Does Domitian think me corrupt when he has triumphed so often while I perform the sacrifices?" She was asking the obvious question. If she had truly been impure, how could Rome have achieved military victories under her watch? Her execution was politically motivated, not religiously justified. The Vestal Virgin institution ended not with a dramatic final trial, but with Christian political triumph. In 394 AD, Emperor Theodosius I outlawed all pagan practices, including the Vestal Order. The sacred flame that had burned for over 1,000 years was deliberately extinguished. The 6 remaining Vestals were released from their vows and expelled from the temple complex. After spending their entire lives within those walls, they were suddenly thrust into a Christian Rome that viewed them as embarrassing remnants of a pagan past. What happened to these final Vestals remains unknown. Christian sources dismiss them in a few sentences. Roman sources had already ceased recording their activities. They simply vanished from history, women whose entire identity had been built around an institution that no longer existed. The temple complex itself was converted into Christian use or left to decay. By the medieval period, it had been largely forgotten, its ruins buried under centuries of urban development. The rediscovery of the Atrium Vestae in the 19th century shocked archaeologists who had assumed ancient descriptions were exaggerated. The excavation revealed a complex exactly matching ancient sources: the circular temple, the House of the Vestals, with its garden courtyard, the statues of chief Vestals lined up along the walls. But the most disturbing finds were the burial chambers. Their existence confirmed what scholars had hoped were merely propaganda. Rome really had buried women alive for over a millennium. The skeletal evidence provided the final horror. Modern forensic analysis revealed that many of the buried women had been conscious when sealed in their tombs. Bone trauma patterns suggested violent struggle, The positioning of remains indicated desperate attempts to escape. These weren't merciful executions disguised as divine judgment. They were calculated torture, designed to maximize suffering while maintaining religious fiction. The Vestal Virgin system represents one of history's most sophisticated examples of using religious authority to enforce psychological torture on women. The genius, if that word can be used, lay not in physical restraint, but in internal policing. From age 6, these girls were taught to fear their own bodies, their own desires, their own humanity. They learned that any impulse toward normal human connection could result in being buried alive. This internalized terror was more effective than any external guard could be. Modern psychological research on cult survivors, religious trauma, and high control groups helps us understand what Vestal Virgins must have experienced: hypervigilance, chronic anxiety, dissociation, difficulty with emotional regulation, and profound confusion about personal identity. The few Vestals who survived their 30 years of service carried this trauma into whatever life remained to them. They had been systematically trained to see themselves as dangerous, their sexuality as pollution, their natural human needs as crimes worthy of death. The Vestal Virgin system wasn't unique to Rome. Similar practices appeared across ancient civilizations, always following the same pattern: taking girls before puberty, imposing lifelong celibacy, enforced by death penalties, granting limited power within a framework of terror, and using religious authority to justify systematic abuse. In ancient Greece, certain temple priestesses faced similar restrictions. In ancient Peru, the Inca maintained chosen women who lived in convent-like structures under threat of execution for sexual activity. In medieval Christianity, enclosed nuns were sometimes walled into cells where they would live until death. The common thread is the use of young women's bodies as symbols of social order. Their virginity becomes community property, their sexuality a threat to cosmic balance. The institution claims to honor them while systematically destroying their autonomy. While modern Western societies don't bury women alive for sexual activity, the underlying psychology of female purity as social property persists in various forms. Religious communities that emphasize virginity until marriage, educational systems that place responsibility for sexual boundaries primarily on girls, media that simultaneously sexualizes young women while shaming them for sexuality. The Vestal Virgin system took these impulses to an extreme, but the impulses themselves remain recognizable. The idea that women's bodies represent honor or shame for their communities, that female sexuality requires exceptional control, that young women's choices about their own bodies are legitimate subjects for public regulation. Understanding the Vestal system helps us recognize these patterns in less extreme forms and question why societies continue investing so much energy in controlling female sexuality specifically. Modern historians remain divided about how to interpret the Vestal Virgin institution. Some argue we should understand it within its cultural context, that Romans genuinely believed these practices were necessary for social stability, that the Vestals themselves may have internalized these values and seen their role as genuinely sacred. Others contend that cultural relativism shouldn't excuse systematic abuse of children, that regardless of Roman beliefs, the reality was girls taken from their families at 6, threatened with live burial for 30 years, and psychologically destroyed in the name of religion. The debate reflects broader questions about how we judge historical practices. Can we acknowledge that Romans believed they were honoring these women while also recognizing the horror of what was actually done to them? Can both things be true simultaneously? The ruins of the Temple of Vesta still stand in the Roman Forum, visited by thousands of tourists each year who know little about what actually happened there. The circular foundation, the scattered columns, the remains of the atrium vestae, all beautiful in the way ruins often are, stripped of their original context and horror. But if you stand there quietly, knowing the history, the space feels different. You're standing where 6 girls and women lived for over a millennium, under constant threat of live burial, where dozens were condemned, paraded through Rome in funeral dress, and sealed alive in underground chambers. The skeletal remains found in those chambers tell us how they died, conscious, struggling, terrified, but they can't tell us what those final hours felt like. The complete darkness after the lamp oil burned out, the gradual realization that no rescue was coming, the choice between conserving oxygen or screaming for help that would never arrive. We can't know if any of them actually were guilty of the sexual activity they were accused of. We can't know if any found moments of genuine joy within the temple complex. We can't know how many spent their 30 years in service, believing the religious justifications they'd been taught since childhood. What we do know is that the system was designed to break young women psychologically while claiming to honor them, that live burial continued for 1,000 years because it served political purposes, that the archaeological evidence confirms every horror ancient sources described. The Vestal Virgins weren't honored priestesses who chose sacred service. They were girls taken from their families, trapped for 30 years under threat of death, and buried alive when politically convenient, all while Rome called it religion. Their story deserves to be told not as ancient history we've moved beyond, but as a reminder of what societies are capable of when they decide young women's bodies are community property rather than their own. If this journey into Rome's darkest reality has moved you, share this video so others can learn what history textbooks leave out. Subscribe for more stories from the shadows of the past. And remember, the ruins may be beautiful, but beauty built on buried bones deserves to be examined honestly.